in the dusty streets of 1875 Arizona Territory. A shy girl with a severe stutter rarely spoke above a whisper until the moment she saw wealthy Boston businessman Charles Brennan approaching the sabotaged stagecoach that would carry innocent families straight into a deadly trap. Her desperate warning would expose a land speculation conspiracy that threatened to destroy her entire town. But would anyone believe the girl who could barely string two words together when it mattered most? Mercy Holloway's hands shook as she dropped the ceramic bowl, watching it shatter across the wooden floor of her father's general store. The crash echoed through the empty building like a gunshot, and she immediately crouched down to gather the pieces before anyone could witness her clumsiness. Outside, the September heat of 1875 baked the Arizona Territory town of Willow Creek until even the lizards sought shade. Her father emerged from the back room, his weathered face creased with concern rather than anger. "Easy there, sweetheart. It's just a bowl." But Mercy knew it wasn't just about the bowl, it was about everything. The way her tongue twisted around simple words, the way customers looked past her when she tried to help them, the way she'd become invisible in her own hometown. Through the dusty window, she watched the morning stagecoach rumble down Main Street, kicking up clouds of red dirt that settled on everything, like a fine coating of shame. The sight made her stomach clench with familiar dread. Strangers meant questions, and questions meant having to speak, and speaking meant the awful moment when words would tangle in her throat like tumbleweeds. "The Henderson order needs to go out today," her father said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Think you can handle the delivery?" Mercy nodded, grateful for tasks that didn't require conversation. She loaded the supplies into their small wagon: flour, coffee beans, a bolt of blue fabric that Mrs. Henderson had ordered for her daughter's wedding dress. The weight of the goods felt manageable compared to the weight of expectations that came with every social interaction. As she guided their old mare down the rutted road toward the Henderson farm, Mercy allowed herself to breathe freely for the first time that morning. Out here, surrounded by endless stretches of scrub brush and distant mesas, her stutter couldn't embarrass anyone. The desert didn't judge her for the way words stumbled from her lips like stones down a hillside. The Henderson farm sat in a small valley, where a seasonal creek provided just enough water for modest crops. Martha Henderson greeted her with the kind of warm smile that made Mercy wish she could be normal just for one conversation. "Mercy, dear, how lovely to see you. Come in for some lemonade, you must be parched in this heat." Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, but I need to get back." The words came out choppy and uneven, each syllable a small battle won and lost. Martha's expression softened with understanding rather than pity, which somehow made it worse. "Of course, dear. Tell your father we appreciate the quick delivery." On the ride back to town, Mercy noticed something odd. Fresh horse tracks crossed the road, not the random patterns of ranch work, but the organized lines of men riding together with purpose. The tracks headed north, toward the hills where Apache war parties had been spotted months ago. A chill ran down her spine, despite the blazing sun. Back in Willow Creek, the stagecoach had stopped in front of the hotel, and passengers were climbing down with the slow, stiff movements of people who'd been traveling for days. Mercy guided her wagon past the depot, trying not to look at the small crowd that always gathered when new arrivals came to town. But one figure caught her attention, a man in expensive clothes who stood apart from the others, surveying the dusty street with intense interest. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his boots polished to a shine that seemed impossible in this desert country. Everything about him spoke of money and education, the kind of person who would never notice someone like her. As she pulled the wagon up to the store's loading dock, voices drifted from the hotel's front porch. The well-dressed stranger was speaking with Sheriff Morrison, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but urgent enough to make the sheriff frown and nod repeatedly. Mercy unhitched the mare and led her to the water trough, stealing glances at the mysterious newcomer. There was something about the way he moved, confident but watchful, like a man who expected trouble but was prepared for it. When he turned in her direction, their eyes met for just a moment, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she quickly looked away. "New fellow's got money," her father observed, appearing beside her with the easy, quiet way he had of moving. "Word is, he's here on business. Land business." The words hit Mercy like a physical blow. Land business in Willow Creek meant only one thing: someone wanted to buy out the small farmers and ranchers who'd built their lives in this harsh but beautiful country. It meant change, and change never seemed to benefit people like her family. As the afternoon wore on, Mercy found herself watching the stranger from behind the store's front counter. He'd taken a room at the hotel and spent most of the day walking the streets, stopping to examine buildings and chat with various townspeople. Each conversation seemed to follow the same pattern: friendly greetings, casual questions about property values, and interested nods when people mentioned their struggles with recent dry spells. When evening came, the stranger sat on the hotel's front porch with a leather journal, writing by lamplight, while the desert air began to cool. There was something almost lonely about the sight: a wealthy man far from home, recording his thoughts in a place where few people would understand his world. Mercy was sweeping the store's front steps when she noticed him looking in her direction. For a moment, she considered retreating inside, but something made her hold her ground. He closed his journal and stood up, walking slowly across the street toward her. Her heart hammered against her ribs as his polished boots clicked against the wooden boardwalk. This was exactly the kind of situation that usually left her speechless and humiliated. But there was nowhere to run without looking like a frightened child. "Good evening," he said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "I'm Charles Brennan, from Boston. I was wondering if you could help me with something." I don't know if I can help," Mercy managed, gripping the broom handle so tightly her knuckles went white. The familiar heat of shame crept up her neck as the words stumbled out, broken and uneven. But Charles Brennan didn't show the usual signs of impatience or embarrassment that most people displayed when she tried to speak. Instead, he smiled, not the polite, uncomfortable grimace she was used to, but something genuine and patient. "I'm looking for someone who knows this area well," he continued, his voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern education. "Someone who might understand the local challenges." Before Mercy could attempt another mangled response, a commotion erupted from the direction of the Stagecoach depot. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete Collins, was kneeling beside one of the rear wheels, his weathered face twisted with frustration. "Spokes cracked clean through," Pete announced to anyone within earshot. "Won't make it another mile, let alone the 20 to Tucson." Charles excused himself and walked over to examine the damaged wheel, running his fingers along the splintered wood with the careful attention of someone who understood machinery. Mercy found herself following, drawn by curiosity, despite her usual instinct to avoid crowds. The other passengers, a middle-aged couple, a traveling salesman, and an elderly woman with a small dog, gathered around Pete as he explained the situation. The nearest replacement parts were in Phoenix, a 3-day ride each way. Even if they sent a man immediately, repairs couldn't be completed for at least a week. "This is intolerable," huffed the salesman, a round man whose red face glistened with sweat. "I have appointments in Tucson. Business can't wait for your incompetence." Pete's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "Wheels don't ask permission before they break, mister. You're welcome to walk if you're in such a hurry." Charles stepped between them before the argument could escalate. "Gentlemen, anger won't fix the wheel any faster. Perhaps we should focus on practical solutions." As the adults debated alternatives, hiring individual horses, sharing wagons with local farmers, or simply waiting for repairs, Mercy noticed something that made her stomach clench with unease. The crack in the wheel wasn't ragged like wood that had split naturally under stress. The edges were too clean, too straight, as if someone had deliberately scored the spoke with a sharp tool. She knelt down and traced the damage with her finger, her heart racing as she confirmed her suspicions. This wasn't an accident, it was sabotage. But who would want to strand travelers in Willow Creek? And why? Find something interesting? Charles had approached quietly, crouching beside her to examine the wheel. This wasn't an accident, Mercy whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. Someone cut this on purpose. Charles studied the crack more closely, his expression growing serious. You're right. The question is, why someone would want to disable the stagecoach? Before Mercy could respond, Sheriff Morrison appeared, drawn by the crowd and commotion. His badge caught the lamplight as he bent to examine the broken wheel, and Mercy saw his eyes narrow with the same suspicion she felt. Pete, you sure this just happened today? The sheriff asked. Wheel was fine this morning when we pulled out of Phoenix, Pete replied. Didn't notice any problems until we stopped here. The sheriff's gaze swept the gathered crowd, lingering on each face as if searching for guilt or deception. When his eyes met Mercy's, she felt compelled to speak, despite her fear of stumbling over the words. Sheriff M. Morrison, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I think someone cut the wheel on purpose. A hush fell over the group as everyone turned to stare at her. The familiar panic rose in her throat, threatening to choke off her words completely, but Charles's encouraging nod gave her the courage to continue. The cut is too straight to be natural, she managed, pointing to the damaged spoke. Someone used a saw or a sharp knife. Sheriff Morrison examined the wheel again, this time with the careful attention of a lawman rather than a concerned citizen. After a long moment, he straightened up, his expression grim. The girl's right, he announced. This was done deliberately. Question is, who had access to the stagecoach, and why would they want to trap passengers in town? The implication sent a chill through the crowd. If someone had sabotaged the wheel, it meant the attack was planned and purposeful. But Willow Creek was a peaceful town where the biggest crimes were usually cattle theft or drunken fights. What could strangers possibly have that someone would risk serious charges to steal? Charles seemed to be thinking along the same lines. Sheriff, is there anything unusual happening in the area? Any reason someone might want to delay travelers? Morrison hesitated, glancing around the crowd before answering. There have been some incidents lately. Cattle missing from ranches. Strange riders seen in the hills. Nothing definite, but folks are on edge. As the crowd began to disperse, discussing the mystery in hushed voices, Charles approached Mercy with a thoughtful expression. You have sharp eyes, miss? H. Holloway. Mercy Holloway. The introduction came easier now, perhaps because he'd already heard her speak and hadn't fled in embarrassment. Miss Holloway, would you be willing to show me around town tomorrow? As a stranded traveler, I'd appreciate a local guide. The request caught her completely off guard. People didn't usually seek out her company, especially wealthy strangers who could afford to hire professional guides. But there was something in Charles's manner, a respectful patience, that made her feel valued rather than pitied. I could show you the main sights, she agreed, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. As Charles returned to the hotel, and Mercy helped her father close the store for the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that the sabotaged stagecoach was connected to something larger and more dangerous than simple robbery. The way Charles had examined the wheel, the careful questions he'd asked the sheriff, the expensive clothes that marked him as someone with serious business interests. It all suggested that his presence in Willow Creek might not be as coincidental as it seemed. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the desert wind rattle the shutters, Mercy wondered what she'd gotten herself into by agreeing to spend time with the mysterious stranger from Boston. Part of her thrilled at the prospect of having someone actually want her company, but another part worried that Charles Brennan might be more dangerous than he appeared. Outside her window, she could hear the distant sound of horses moving through the darkness, not the random wandering of ranch stock, but the purposeful movement of riders who had somewhere important to go. The sound filled her with unease, and she found herself thinking about the fresh tracks she'd seen that morning, the sabotaged stagecoach wheel, and the careful way Charles had questioned the sheriff about local troubles. Whatever was happening in Willow Creek, Mercy had the growing certainty that tomorrow would bring answers she might not be prepared to hear. The hammer crashed down on Charles's thumb with a sickening thud, sending pain shooting up his arm like lightning. He bit back a curse and shook his hand, watching blood well up under the nail. 3 days of trying to fix the stagecoach wheel had taught him that money couldn't buy skill with tools. "You're holding it wrong," came a soft voice behind him. Charles spun around to find Mercy standing at the edge of the livery stable, clutching a small basket against her chest. The morning sun caught the copper threads in her brown hair, and for a moment he forgot about his throbbing thumb. "I brought you some bread," she stammered, holding out the basket. "Mama made extra." He accepted the gift with his good hand, surprised by the warmth still radiating from the cloth-wrapped loaves. "Thank you. That's very kind." Mercy's eyes darted to the damaged wheel, propped against the stable wall. "Papa says you've been out here since sunrise every day." "Not much else to do while I wait for parts from Phoenix." Charles set down the hammer and flexed his fingers. "I'm not very good at being idle." "Maybe you could try being useful instead," Mercy said, then immediately flushed red. Sorry, that sounded." "No, you're right," Charles laughed, genuinely amused. "What did you have in mind?" Before she could answer, the sound of galloping hooves filled the air. Sheriff Morrison rode into town like the devil himself was chasing him, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. He pulled up hard in front of the general store, dust swirling around him in thick clouds. "Emergency meeting," he shouted to anyone within earshot. "Church bell in 10 minutes." Charles and Mercy exchanged glances. The sheriff's face was pale beneath his sun-weathered skin, and his hands shook as he dismounted. Whatever news he carried, it wasn't good. "We should go," Mercy whispered. They joined the stream of townspeople hurrying toward the white-painted church at the end of Main Street. Charles noticed how the crowd seemed to part around Mercy. Not cruelly, but with the unconscious avoidance people showed toward those who made them uncomfortable. She walked with her head down, as if trying to make herself invisible. Inside the church, the wooden pews creaked under the weight of worried families. Children sensed the adult tension and clung to their mothers' skirts. The air felt thick and close, heavy with the scent of nervous sweat and fear. Sheriff Morrison stood at the front, his badge catching the colored light from the stained glass windows. His usual confident posture was gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of a man carrying terrible news. "Folks," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "I just rode back from the Morrison Ranch 20 miles south. They were hit yesterday at dawn." A gasp ran through the congregation like wind through wheat. Mrs. Henderson clutched her baby tighter, while her husband's hand moved instinctively to the gun at his hip. "Apache?" called out Tom Bradley from the back pew. Morrison nodded grimly. "Took every horse they had. Burned the barn to the ground. Jim Morrison and his boys barely made it to the root cellar in time." "How many?" This from Dr. Walsh, the town's only physician. "Hard to say. Jim thinks maybe 15-20 warriors. They came out of nowhere, hit fast, and disappeared back into the desert." Charles felt Mercy tense beside him. Her breathing had become shallow and quick, like a trapped animal. He wanted to offer comfort, but didn't know how, without drawing unwanted attention to her. "What's being done?" demanded Jake Sullivan from his prominent seat in the front row. Charles had met Sullivan briefly at the hotel, a hard-eyed man who seemed to own half the businesses in town. "I've sent word to Fort Apache, but they're dealing with troubles of their own up north. Could be weeks before they can spare any cavalry." Morrison's voice grew harder. "Until then, we're on our own." The church erupted in worried chatter. Some families immediately began making plans to leave town. Others, those with deeper roots or fewer resources, talked about fortifying their homes and businesses. "Now hold on," Sullivan's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Let's not panic. These Apache, they're after horses and supplies. They don't want to fight with a whole town." "Tell that to the Morrisons," muttered someone from the middle pews. Charles studied Sullivan's face, As the man continued speaking, something didn't sit right about his calm confidence. Most people hearing news of Apache raids would show at least some concern, but Sullivan seemed almost satisfied. "I think we should organize patrols," Dr. Walsh suggested. "Groups of armed men riding the perimeter of town." "Good idea," Morrison agreed. "Every man who can handle a rifle should volunteer. We'll set up a schedule, make sure someone's always watching the approaches." As the meeting continued, Charles noticed Mercy growing paler by the minute. Her hands gripped the edge of the pew so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. "Are you all right?" he whispered. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, then leaned closer to him. "Something's wrong," she breathed. So quietly, he had to strain to hear. "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, Sullivan stood up again. "I think we should also consider that some folks might want to leave town until this situation resolves itself. No shame in protecting your families." "And go where?" challenged Mrs. Peterson, whose husband ran the blacksmith shop. "Our whole life is here. Phoenix, Tucson, even California, if necessary," Sullivan replied smoothly. "I happen to know there's a stagecoach leaving tomorrow morning. Could take anyone who wants to go." Charles felt a chill run down his spine. His own stagecoach, the one with the mysteriously broken wheel, was suddenly ready to travel again? The timing seemed more than coincidental. After the meeting dispersed, he and Mercy walked slowly back toward the general store. The afternoon heat pressed down on them like a heavy blanket, but Mercy was still shivering slightly. "What did you mean back there?" Charles asked, when they were out of earshot of other people. "About something being wrong?" Mercy stopped walking and turned to face him. For once, she looked directly into his eyes instead of at the ground. "My uncle was a scout for the army," she said carefully. "Before he died, he taught me things. How to read sign, how to track." She paused, gathering courage. "I went out to the Morrison place this morning, before the sheriff got back." Charles felt his pulse quicken. "And? The tracks don't match. Apache ponies are shod different, if at all. These horses had regular shoes, like cavalry mounts or ranch horses." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the stutter fading with conviction. "And the burn pattern on the barn, it was set from inside, not outside." The implications hit Charles like a physical blow. If Mercy was right, then the raid hadn't been Apache at all. Someone was staging attacks to create fear and panic in the town. But who would benefit from driving people away? His gaze drifted toward Sullivan's house on the hill, with its fresh paint and expensive furnishings. A man who dealt in land and property might have reasons to want people scared enough to sell cheap and leave fast. "Have you told anyone else about this?" he asked. Mercy shook her head. "Who would believe me? I'm just the girl who can't even talk right." But Charles was beginning to think that Mercy Holloway might be the smartest person in Willow Creek. And if she was right about the false Apache raid, then tomorrow's stagecoach departure could be walking straight into a trap. Thunder rumbled across the desert like the footsteps of angry giants. Though no clouds darkened the star-filled sky above Willow Creek, Mercy pressed her face against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching shadows move between the buildings below. 3 men on horseback were talking in hushed voices near the livery stable, their forms barely visible in the moonlight. She recognized one of them, immediately Jake Sullivan's distinctive slouched posture, and the fancy silver conchos on his hatband caught what little light filtered through the darkness. The other 2 were strangers, rough-looking men with the kind of careful alertness that came from living on the wrong side of the law. "Tomorrow morning, when the stage pulls out," Sullivan was saying, his voice carrying on the still night air. Mercy held her breath and strained to hear more, but the wind shifted and carried their words away. Whatever they were planning, it involved the morning stagecoach, the same coach that Charles would probably be taking now that the wheel was supposedly fixed. A movement in the hotel window across the street caught her attention. Charles stood silhouetted against the lamplight in his room, also watching the mysterious meeting below. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he gripped the window frame. The three men finished their conversation and rode off in different directions, leaving behind only hoofprints and the lingering scent of tobacco smoke. Sullivan headed toward his big house on the hill, while the strangers disappeared into the maze of side streets and alleys that honeycombed the older part of town. Mercy slipped from her room and crept downstairs, careful to avoid the squeaky board near the bottom step. Her parents were sound asleep, exhausted from a day spent preparing the store for possible evacuation. She eased open the front door and stepped into the cool night air. Charles was already waiting for her in the shadow of the water trough, as if he'd somehow known she would come. "You saw them too," he said without preamble. She nodded, surprised by how natural it felt to meet him like this, two conspirators sharing secrets in the darkness. Sullivan and two others, they were talking about the Stagecoach. "I think we were right about the fake raid," Charles said grimly. "And I think tomorrow's departure is part of whatever scheme they're running." Mercy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. The Henderson family signed up to leave on that stage, and the Walkers, with their new baby. "We need proof," Charles said. "Something concrete that we can take to Sheriff Morrison. He won't believe us. Sullivan owns half this town, and I'm just—" "You're the bravest person I've ever met," Charles interrupted firmly. "And you're right about the tracks and the barn. I trust your judgment more than anyone else's right now." The unexpected praise sent warmth flooding through Mercy's chest. No one had ever called her brave before. Most people saw only the stutter, the nervous fidgeting, the way she hid from attention. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "Follow them. See where they go. What they're planning." Charles checked the gun at his hip, a small revolver that looked almost toy-like in his large hands. But it could be dangerous. Mercy thought about the Henderson children, barely old enough to walk, and the way Mrs. Walker had smiled when she showed off her month-old son. Whatever Sullivan was planning, innocent people were going to get hurt. "I know these streets better than anyone," she said, "and I know how to move quiet." They set off through the sleeping town like ghosts, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main thoroughfares. Mercy led the way, choosing a route that took them behind buildings and through narrow gaps between structures. Her uncle's tracking lessons had included more than just reading sign in the dirt. He'd taught her how to become invisible when necessary. The trail led them to the old mining camp on the outskirts of town, a collection of abandoned shacks and rusted equipment, left over from the silver boom of the early 1860s. Most people avoided the place, claiming it was haunted by the spirits of miners who died in cave-ins and accidents. But tonight, the camp was very much alive. Lanterns glowed in the windows of 3 different buildings, and Mercy could hear the low murmur of multiple conversations. She counted at least a dozen horses tied to makeshift hitching posts, far more men than she'd seen during the midnight meeting. "This is bigger than we thought," Charles whispered. They crept closer, using the ruins of an old smelting operation for cover. Through a broken window, Mercy could see into what had once been the camp's main bunkhouse. Sullivan stood at one end of the room, addressing a crowd of rough-looking men. Some she recognized as drifters who occasionally passed through town. Others were complete strangers. "Stage leaves at 8 sharp, Sullivan was saying. "You hit them at Dead Man's Gulch, just like we discussed. Make it look good, war paint, feathers, the whole show. But remember, we want them scared, not dead. Dead passengers ask too many questions." One of the men, a scarred individual with tobacco-stained teeth, raised his hand. "What about the rich boy, the one from back east?" Sullivan's expression darkened. "Brennan's become a problem. He's been asking too many questions, poking around where he doesn't belong. Maybe it's time he learned that Arizona territory can be dangerous for outsiders who don't mind their own business." Mercy felt Charles tense beside her, his hand moving unconsciously toward his gun. But she grabbed his wrist, shaking her head frantically. They were outnumbered 12-1, and charging in now would only get them both killed. "Tomorrow morning, after we stage the attack, people will be so scared they'll sell their property for whatever we offer," Sullivan continued. "The railroad's coming through here next year, and every acre of land is going to be worth 10 times what these fools paid for it. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked together in Mercy's mind. Sullivan wasn't just trying to drive people away, he was manipulating them into selling valuable land for practically nothing. The fake Apache raids, the mysterious accidents and problems that had been plaguing local ranchers, even Charles's broken stagecoach wheel. It was all part of an elaborate scheme to create panic and desperation. "What about the girl?" asked another man. "The stuttering one who's been sniffing around asking questions?" Mercy's blood turned to ice. They knew about her investigation. "She's nobody," Sullivan said dismissively. "A half-wit who can barely string two words together. Even if she figured something out, who would believe her?" The casual cruelty in his voice cut deeper than any physical blow. Mercy had heard such dismissive words her entire life, but they still had the power to wound. She was nobody. Just a girl with a speech impediment who worked in her father's store. But then Charles's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing gently. His touch reminded her that she wasn't alone anymore, and that being underestimated could sometimes be an advantage. The meeting was breaking up, with men drifting out in small groups to avoid attracting attention. Sullivan gave final instructions about timing and meeting points, then headed for his horse. "We need to get back to town," Charles whispered. "Warn the sheriff, stop that stagecoach from leaving." But as they prepared to leave their hiding spot, Mercy heard something that made her heart skip a beat. The sound of approaching footsteps, heavy boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. "Check the perimeter," Sullivan's voice called out. "Make sure we weren't followed." They were trapped, crouched behind the rusted remains of mining equipment while armed men searched the area around them. Discovery would mean certain death. Sullivan couldn't afford to let witnesses escape alive. Mercy closed her eyes and tried to think like her uncle had taught her. Where would a frightened animal hide when predators were hunting? How could two people become invisible in a landscape of shadows and ruins? The answer came to her in a flash of inspiration. She tugged on Charles's sleeve and pointed toward an old mine shaft, whose entrance was partially hidden by collapsed timbers. It would be dangerous. The tunnel could be unstable, filled with bad air or unexpected drops, but it was their only chance. They crawled on hands and knees toward the shaft opening, moving as silently as spiders across a web. Behind them, the searchers were getting closer, their lanterns casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach out with grasping fingers. Just as they reached the mine entrance, a shout rang out. "Over here, I found tracks!" Mercy's bare feet made no sound on the cool wooden floor as she crept toward the store's front window. Something had woken her, a voice, maybe two, drifting through the night air like smoke from a dying campfire. The moon hung fat and yellow above Willow Creek, casting everything in an eerie glow that made familiar shapes look strange and threatening. She pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging the surface as she peered into the street. Two men stood beside the broken stagecoach, their shadows long and twisted. One was Charles Brennan, still wearing his fine clothes, despite the late hour. The other made her stomach clench with recognition. Jake Sullivan, the man who'd taken the Morrison farm last winter, when they couldn't pay their debts. "The deal was simple, Brennan," Sullivan's voice carried clearly in the still air. "You come to town, make yourself visible, keep people calm while we handle the rest." Charles stepped backward, his hands raised. "That's not what I agreed to. You said we were buying land from willing sellers." "Willing?" Sullivan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Nobody's willing to sell good land cheap unless they're scared enough to run." Mercy's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd heard whispers about Sullivan's methods, how farms mysteriously caught fire right before their owners decided to sell, how cattle wandered off just when families needed money most. But this was different. This was bigger. "The Apache raids," Charles said slowly, understanding creeping into his voice. "Those weren't real, were they?" "Smart man." Sullivan spat into the dust. "My boys put on a good show, didn't they? War paint, feathers, the whole dance. People see what they expect to see." The blood drained from Mercy's face. Mrs. Henderson had cried for 2 days after hearing about the raids, clutching her baby so tight the child couldn't stop fussing. Old Mr. Peters had boarded up his windows and refused to let his granddaughter play outside. All that fear, all that pain, it was fake. "You're talking about murder," Charles said, his voice tight with horror. "If people think they're under attack, nobody has to die if they're smart about it." Sullivan cut him off. "Pack up, get out, sell cheap. Simple as that. And if they don't?" Sullivan's silence was answer enough. Charles began pacing, his polished boots clicking against the hard-packed earth. "I won't be part of this. Find another front man. Too late for cold feet, Boston boy." Sullivan moved closer, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "You're already here. People know your name. You think you can just walk away? Watch me." "I don't think so." Sullivan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but Mercy caught every word. "See, tomorrow's the big show, real dramatic stuff. The kind that'll have every family in town begging to sell by sundown." Mercy pressed closer to the window, her pulse racing. What did he mean by the big show? "We're done talking, Brennan. You'll play your part, or you'll find out what Apache arrows feel like up close." Sullivan walked away, his spurs jingling with each step. Charles remained by the stagecoach, running his hands through his hair like a man trying to wake from a nightmare. Mercy stumbled backward from the window, her mind spinning. She'd thought Charles was just another rich man looking to make money off their misery. But he'd tried to walk away. He'd refused to be part of Sullivan's plan. Still, he was part of it whether he wanted to be or not. And tomorrow, whatever Sullivan had planned for tomorrow, it was going to hurt innocent people. She thought about the Henderson family, with their 3 little children who played in the dirt outside the hotel every morning. She thought about Dr. Williams, who'd delivered half the babies in town and never asked for payment when times were hard. She thought about her own father, who'd built their store with his bare hands and trusted everyone until they proved him wrong. All of them were in danger because of Sullivan's greed and Charles's mistake. The floorboards creaked as she walked back to her room, each step feeling heavier than the last. Outside her window, she could see Charles still standing alone in the moonlight, looking like a man who'd lost everything that mattered. Maybe he had, but Mercy was starting to realize that sometimes losing everything was the only way to figure out what was really worth fighting for. And tomorrow, when Sullivan's big show began, she might be the only person in Willow Creek who knew the truth. The question was, would anyone believe a girl who could barely speak without stumbling over her own words? She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, knowing sleep wouldn't come. In a few hours, the sun would rise on what might be the worst day in Willow Creek's history. Unless someone found the courage to speak up, even if that someone was the last person anyone would expect to find their voice when it mattered most. The morning sun painted Willow Creek in shades of gold and amber as Charles Brennan stood outside Holloway's general store, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the door handle. He'd spent the entire night walking the empty streets, wrestling with a decision that would either save his conscience or destroy his future. Inside the store, Mercy looked up from sorting bolts of fabric, her eyes widening with surprise. Her father emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "Mr. Brennan," Thomas Holloway said, with the careful politeness reserved for customers who might cause trouble. "What brings you by so early?" Charles removed his hat, his expensive clothes looking out of place among the simple goods that filled the shelves. "I need to tell you something important. Both of you." Mercy's heart began to race. She set down the fabric and moved closer, sensing that whatever Charles had to say would change everything. "Maybe we should sit," Charles suggested, gesturing toward the wooden chairs near the store's small, pot-bellied stove. "I'll stand, thank you," Thomas replied, crossing his arms. "Say your piece." Charles took a deep breath, the words coming out in a rush like water breaking through a dam. "The Apache raids, they're not real. Jake Sullivan hired men to dress up and terrorize people. The goal is to scare families into selling their land cheap. The silence that followed was so complete that Mercy could hear her own heartbeat. Her father's face went through several changes: confusion, disbelief, and finally a cold anger she'd rarely seen. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Brennan." "I have proof." Charles pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. Letters from Sullivan's partners back east. Plans, payment schedules for the fake raiders, even a map showing which properties they want most. Thomas took the papers with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the contents. With each line he read, his face grew paler. "Dear God," he whispered. "The Morrison place, the Peterson Ranch, they're all marked here." Mercy found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why are you telling us this?" Charles looked directly at her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected: shame, mixed with determination. "Because I came here to buy land from you people. I thought I was part of a legitimate business deal. When I learned the truth." He paused, struggling with the words. "I realized I had a choice. I could stay silent and become rich, or I could do what's right." "What's Sullivan planning next?" Thomas demanded. "Something big. Today." He called it the big show. Something that would have every family in town wanting to sell by sundown. Mercy felt ice form in her stomach. "The Stagecoach," she stammered. "The one with the broken wheel. Is it really broken?" Charles's expression answered her question before his words did. "Sullivan's men damaged it on purpose. They're planning to stage an attack on whoever tries to leave town today. Make it look like the Apache are getting bolder, more violent." "But people could die," Thomas said, his voice hollow with horror. "That's what I told Sullivan," he said. "If he said nobody had to die, if people were smart enough to run." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Sullivan was willing to kill innocent people to steal their land. Mercy thought about the families who might climb aboard that stagecoach today. The Hendersons, with their baby, old Mrs. Patterson, who wanted to visit her sister in Tucson, maybe even young couples, looking to start fresh somewhere safer. "We have to warn them," she said, her stutter almost gone in her urgency. "Who's going to believe us?" Thomas asked. "Sullivan's been in this territory for 5 years. He's got friends, connections. We're just shopkeepers. And I'm an outsider who was part of the scheme until yesterday," Charles added bitterly. "My word won't carry much weight either." But Mercy was already moving toward the door, her mind racing with possibilities. "Sheriff Morrison," she said, "if we show him the papers." "Morrison's been in Sullivan's pocket for months," Thomas interrupted. "How do you think Sullivan knew which properties to target?" The truth hit them all at the same time. They were alone in this. 3 people against a conspiracy that reached into every corner of their small community. Charles sank into one of the chairs, his head in his hands. "I've made such a mess of things. I thought I could just walk away." But Sullivan made it clear. That wasn't an option. "Then we make our own options," Mercy said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. Both men looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You're just a girl," Thomas said gently. "This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is." Mercy straightened her shoulders, feeling something new and powerful growing inside her chest. "This is our town. These are our neighbors. If we don't fight for them, who will?" Charles lifted his head, studying her face with new respect. "What do you have in mind?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I know we can't let innocent people get on that stagecoach. And we can't let Sullivan destroy our town just to line his pockets." Outside, the morning bustle was beginning as people started their daily routines, unaware that danger was closing in around them like a net. Mercy could see Mrs. Henderson hanging laundry on the line behind the hotel, her children playing in the dirt nearby. In a few hours, Sullivan's big show would begin. People would panic, sell their homes for whatever they could get, and scatter to the winds like tumbleweeds, unless 3 unlikely allies could find a way to stop it. Mercy's bare feet slammed against the wooden boardwalk as she sprinted toward the waiting stagecoach. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears, drowning out everything except the terrible knowledge that innocent people were about to die. The Henderson family stood beside the coach door, little Emma, clutching her favorite doll while her two brothers fidgeted in their Sunday clothes. Mrs. Henderson was counting their traveling money one last time, her face tight with worry about leaving everything they'd built in Willow Creek behind. "Don't get in the stagecoach," Mercy's voice cracked like a whip across the morning air. Every person on Main Street turned to stare at the girl who usually whispered apologies for taking up space. Mrs. Henderson's hand froze on the coach door handle. "Mercy? What are you talking about, child?" "The wheel," Mercy gasped, pointing at the repaired spoke that gleamed too new against the weathered wood. "It's been sabotaged. Sullivan's men are waiting 3 miles out to attack you." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward from the crowd that was gathering. His weathered face showed confusion mixed with concern. "Now, Mercy, that's a mighty serious claim you're making. What makes you think—" "Because I saw them." The words tumbled out faster than her stutter could catch them. "Last night, Sullivan and his men were positioning themselves along Copper Canyon Road. They're dressed like Apache warriors, but they're not real Indians." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed doubt, others fear. Old Pete Jameson spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Girl's always been touched in the head. Can barely speak normal on a good day." Heat flooded Mercy's cheeks, but Charles Brennan stepped beside her before the shame could steal her voice. "She's telling the truth," he said clearly. "I have proof." From his coat pocket, he pulled out a folded piece of paper covered with handwriting. "This is a letter from Sullivan to his partners in Phoenix. He describes the entire plan, fake Apache raids to drive down land prices, then swooping in to buy properties for a fraction of their worth." Dr. Whitman pushed through the crowd, his medical bag bouncing against his hip. "Let me see that letter, young man." As Charles handed over the evidence, Mercy noticed Sullivan's horse tied behind the bank. Her stomach dropped. He was here, somewhere in the crowd, watching his carefully planned scheme crumble. "There's more," Charles continued. "The wheel repair was deliberately weakened. It's designed to break apart exactly 3 miles from town, right where Sullivan's men are waiting in war paint and feathers." Mrs. Henderson pulled her children away from the stagecoach, as if it had suddenly caught fire. "But why would anyone want to hurt us?" "Because scared people sell cheap," Sheriff Morrison said grimly, studying the letter. "And desperate people don't ask questions about who's buying." A commotion erupted near the bank as Sullivan emerged, his face dark with rage. "This is nonsense," he shouted. "You're all listening to a half-wit girl and a fancy stranger who showed up 3 days ago." "Then explain this letter," Dr. Whitman said, holding up the evidence. "It's in your handwriting, Jake. I've seen enough of your IOUs to recognize it." Sullivan's eyes darted around the crowd like a trapped animal. That could be forged by anyone with decent penmanship. "What about the wheel?" Mercy found her courage growing stronger with each word. "Why would someone repair it so poorly unless they wanted it to break?" The crowd pressed closer as the coach driver knelt beside his vehicle. Tom Bradley had been driving stagecoaches for 15 years, and his experienced hands could read wood and metal like other men read books. After a long moment, he stood up with splinters in his palm. "She's right," he announced. "This spoke's been weakened with a saw blade, then covered with wood putty and paint. It would have snapped clean through the moment we hit rough ground." A collective gasp rose from the townspeople. Children moved closer to their parents, while men's hands drifted toward their gun belts. Sullivan backed toward his horse. "You can't prove anything. Maybe the repair was just shoddy work." "Then explain these," Charles said, pulling out a second paper. "Telegraph messages between you and your associates, discussing timing and payment schedules. And explain why your men are camped in Copper Canyon with war paint and stolen Indian ponies," added a new voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to see Running Bear, one of the few Apache who traded peacefully with Willow Creek. He'd emerged from the crowd's edge like a shadow made solid. "My cousin saw white men playing dress-up 2 miles from here. They smell like whiskey and fear, not like warriors." Sullivan's face went pale. The net was closing around him, woven from threads of evidence he'd never imagined anyone would discover. His hand moved toward the gun at his hip. "I wouldn't," Sheriff Morrison said calmly, his own weapon already drawn. "You're outnumbered about 30 to 1, and half these folks are armed." "This isn't over," Sullivan snarled. "You people have no idea what forces you're dealing with. There are bigger players than me in this game." "Maybe," Charles replied, "but they're not here, and you are." As the sheriff moved to arrest Sullivan, Mercy felt her legs go weak. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, replaced by the magnitude of what had just happened. She'd spoken up in front of the entire town, challenged a dangerous man, and helped expose a conspiracy that could have destroyed lives. Charles caught her elbow as she swayed. "Are you all right?" She looked around at the faces watching her, no longer with pity or dismissal, but with respect and gratitude. Mrs. Henderson approached with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, dear. You saved my children's lives." Little Emma tugged on Mercy's skirt. "You're brave," the 6-year-old announced. "Braver than anyone." As Sullivan was led away in handcuffs, his threats echoing down Main Street, Mercy realized that her voice, the voice she'd hidden for so long, had finally found its purpose. She'd discovered that courage wasn't about speaking perfectly. It was about speaking truth when truth needed to be heard. 6 months had painted Willow Creek in shades of prosperity that nobody could have imagined during those dark September days of 1875. The morning sun caught the fresh paint on storefront signs and glinted off new glass windows that replaced boards and canvas. Mercy arranged bolts of colorful fabric in her family's expanded general store, humming a tune she'd learned from the traveling music teacher who now visited monthly. The melody came easily to her lips, another small miracle in a life that had become full of them. "Good morning, Miss Holloway." Charles Brennan's voice carried the same patient warmth it had held during their first meeting, though now it held notes of something deeper. She looked up from the silk ribbons she was displaying, meeting his eyes with confidence that would have seemed impossible just months ago. "Good morning, Mr. Brennan. How are the new schoolhouse plans coming along?" "Better than expected." He pulled out rolled blueprints and spread them across the counter. "The territorial government approved our request for funding, and we should break ground next month." Mercy studied the drawings, tracing the outline of classrooms and a small library with her finger. "The children will love having their own school building instead of sharing space with the church. And they'll have an excellent teacher," Charles said, his meaning clear. Heat rose in her cheeks, but it was pleasure now, not shame. "I still stutter sometimes." "Good teachers care more about their students than their own perfection," he replied. "Besides, you speak more clearly now than half the politicians I knew back east." The store door chimed as Dr. Whitman entered, followed by his wife carrying a basket covered with checkered cloth. "Morning, Mercy." "Charles, Mrs. Whitman made extra biscuits if you're interested." "Always," Mercy said, lifting the cloth to reveal golden brown biscuits that smelled like butter and honey. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing, dear. Consider it payment for what you did last fall." The gratitude still surprised her sometimes. For years, she'd believed her stutter made her a burden to the community. Now she understood that her worth had never been measured by how smoothly words flowed from her tongue, but by her willingness to speak difficult truths when others stayed silent. Charles rolled up his blueprints as more customers entered the store. The morning rush had become a pleasant routine. Ranchers buying supplies, wives selecting fabric, children pressed against the candy jar with hopeful faces. "Walk with me," Charles asked when the crowd thinned. They stepped onto Main Street, where construction sounds echoed from 3 different building projects. The barber shop was doubling in size. The hotel was adding a second story, and a new restaurant was rising where Sullivan's old land office had stood. "Hard to believe it's the same place," Mercy observed, watching a crew of workers unload lumber from a wagon. "It's not the same place," Charles said. "It's what this place was meant to become once honest people were free to build it." They walked past the new telegraph office, where messages now arrived daily instead of weekly. past the expanded livery stable, where horses stamped and whinnied in clean stalls, past the small newspaper office, where the weekly Willow Creek Gazette printed news that actually mattered to local families. At the edge of town, they paused beside the cemetery, where a simple marker honored the memory of those who'd been hurt by Sullivan's schemes. 2 ranchers had lost their life savings before the conspiracy was exposed. One family had been forced to abandon their homestead when they couldn't afford the inflated prices for basic supplies. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed quiet that morning?" Charles asked. Mercy considered the question seriously. People would have been hurt, maybe killed. The Hendersons, probably others. Sullivan would have gotten away with stealing half the town, and you'd still be hiding in the back of your father's store, convinced you had nothing valuable to offer. She smiled at the memory of that frightened girl. "I thought my stutter made me worthless." "It made you careful with words," Charles corrected. "When you finally spoke, people listened, because they knew you wouldn't waste their time with empty chatter." A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals that lifted it higher without effort. Mercy watched its graceful flight and thought about how fear had once kept her earthbound, afraid to test her wings. Now she understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the willingness to fly despite it. "The territorial judge sent word yesterday," Charles said. "Sullivan's trial is set for next month in Phoenix. They'll need you to testify." Her stomach fluttered, but not with the paralyzing terror she would have felt before. "Will you come with me?" "If you want me to." "I do." The words came easily. "Honestly, I want you to come with me everywhere." Charles stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Mercy, I need to tell you something I should have said months ago." Her heart began beating faster, but with anticipation now, not fear. "I came to Willow Creek to make money," he continued. "I planned to buy land, develop it quickly, and return to Boston with a profit. I never expected to find a reason to stay." "What changed your mind?" "You did." His hand found hers, calloused now from honest work instead of soft from luxury. "You showed me that there's more to life than accumulating wealth. You taught me that real courage isn't about having power. It's about using whatever power you have to protect people who need protecting." The morning sun warmed her face as she looked into eyes that had learned to see past surface appearances, to recognize genuine worth. "I never thought anyone like you would want someone like me." "Someone like you?" Charles's voice held gentle confusion. "You mean someone brave enough to stand up to armed men when innocent lives were at stake? Someone kind enough to worry about a stranger's safety? Someone smart enough to piece together a complex conspiracy that fooled half the territory?" When he put it that way, Mercy began to see herself through different eyes, not as a broken girl with a speech impediment, but as someone who had found strength she never knew she possessed. "Besides," Charles added with a smile, "I've discovered that the most interesting conversations happen when people take time to choose their words carefully." In the distance, the morning stagecoach approached right on schedule, its wheels sound and its passengers safe. The driver waved as he passed the same Tom Bradley who'd helped expose Sullivan's sabotage. Behind him rode the Wells Fargo guard, alert but relaxed in a territory that had learned to police itself effectively. Mercy watched the coach disappear around the bend toward Tucson, carrying mail and supplies and dreams toward their destinations. She thought about journeys and destinations, about the difference between running away from something and moving toward something better. "I love you, Mercy Holloway," Charles said simply. "Will you marry me?" The question hung in the morning air, like the promise of rain after a long drought. For a moment, the old fear rose in her throat. What if she wasn't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough for such happiness? Then she remembered little Emma Henderson calling her brave, remembered Sheriff Morrison asking her opinion about community matters, remembered the pride in her father's eyes when neighbors praised his daughter's courage. "Yes," she said clearly, her stutter nowhere to be found. "Yes, I will." As Charles swept her into his arms, Mercy understood that the most important journeys weren't measured in miles traveled. but in the courage to speak when silence would be safer, and in the connections forged when two people see past surface differences to recognize the worth that lies beneath. The desert wind carried the scent of rain and new possibilities, and for the first time in her life, Mercy Holloway wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring.